Good evening, I'm Maciej Mikos and you're watching World News Tonight live from Warsaw. Poland is at cyber war with Russia, says Deputy Prime Minister Gawkowski. Will the attacks intensify? And is Poland prepared to counter them ahead of the presidential elections next month? We'll be looking for answers in a moment, but first, let's look at the latest headlines. Markets react to plans for the repolonization of economy. The EU is considering using a nuclear option against Budapest. And top US officials travel to Paris to discuss the progress of peace talks on Ukraine. Russian and Belarusian adversaries are present in Poland and the country is at cyber war with Moscow, warns Polish Deputy Prime Minister Gawkowski. Our reporter Ovid Juszniczeja attended a conference on Polish cybersecurity in Warsaw and reports on the country's cyber preparedness ahead of the presidential elections next month.
The Polish Minister of Digital Affairs has no doubt. Poland is at cyber war.
There are no Russian tanks rolling through the Polish streets and no Russian planes flying over Poland. But we already have such figurative tanks in our cyberspace.
At the beginning of April, the same minister said that Russia and Belarus are trying to steal Polish elections after a cyber attack on one of Poland's largest political parties. Russian hackers tried to take control of the computers at the Civic Coalition's election headquarters.
If Polish people lose faith in democracy and in the procedures that are implemented here and based on Polish constitution, the better for our enemies.
To protect the democratic process, Poland has established a so-called election umbrella, which aims to enhance the security of Polish cyber systems. The program is only lookout for illegal content, bot networks and disinformation groups. The aim of the attacks doesn't necessarily have to be boosting a particular candidate.
I wouldn't be so sure whether we can expect boosting up any particular candidate. If there will be any direct influence, it's going to reach every single candidate because the more destabilized results of the elections we achieve, the better outcome for the Russian Federation it will be.
Along with the election protection umbrella, Polish authorities are also monitoring financial flows from abroad.
They could be used to illegally finance election campaigns and manipulate algorithms, as in the Romanian variant.
Romania's presidential elections were annulled by the Constitutional Court amid unclear financing and accusations of Russian meddling in favor of pro-Russian frontrunner Călin Georgescu. A report by the French government's cybersecurity watchdog says that foreign interference, like in the Romanian case, is possible in other countries.
This kind of manipulation paired with financial resources and influencer networks could easily be replicated in France. There are also signs that dormant French language accounts, possibly pre-positioned for future use, exist on TikTok.
The text also concludes that social media platforms are not capable of detecting and mitigating these tactics. Polish authorities share this concern. That's why the country will spend nearly €1 billion on cybersecurity this year, which is a record sum. For TVP World, Ovid Juszniczeja.
The stock market shares of Polish state-owned energy companies have dropped on Wednesday in the aftermath of Prime Minister Donald Tusk's announcement of a major shift in the country's economy. The announcement in question took place only a month ahead of crucial presidential elections. Aisha Abachi reports on the first effects of the so-called repolonization of economy or the prioritizing of national interests in the economy.
Repolonization was the buzzword of Polish Prime Minister Donald Tusk's address at the European Forum for New Ideas in Warsaw on Tuesday, where he announced the end of an era of naive globalization.
It's time to rebuild the national economy. It's time to reshore the Polish economy and capital markets.
I think the Polish Prime Minister joins the club. Because it's the phenomenon which is to be observed elsewhere in the world, especially in the United States of America.
If maximizing the profits of a state-owned company made sense, then why would the state even be involved in such a company?
But his new Poland-first approach didn't sit well with investors. Only a day after Tusk's speech, shares in one of Poland's largest energy companies, PGE, fell by almost 10%. Declines also affected other companies in the sector. Tauron dropped over 7%, while Enea lost 2.5%.
Whoever bought the shares of our energy company, counting on high dividends, and now is more in the mood to sell them.
The new direction also raises the question of how compatible it can be with the EU's single market.
Of course, this is a certain problem from the point of view of European Union, because everybody did it, but nobody was saying it out loud. So the question is now whether we are going as a European Union in the direction of, again, erecting barriers between the countries and privileging own companies.
While the Prime Minister's stance may not come as a surprise to experts, the timing of this radical policy announcement raises eyebrows, especially with Poland's presidential elections just around the corner.
Of course, this is a part of taking over the right-wing narrative by civic platform. We've seen that before with refugees and migrants. This is another step of taking the platform of the right-wing parties in the attempt to deprive them of oxygen. And of course, this also plays into ongoing presidential campaign because on one side we have, let's say, not stellar performance of Mr. Gawkowski during the Koński debates.
Civic Coalition presidential candidate Warsaw Mayor Rafał Trzaskowski lost up to 5% points in the poll as a result of the debate on April 11th. Meanwhile, the ratings of his main opponent, historian Karol Nawrocki, backed by the Lord and Justice, rose.
So right now the question, what kind of action will follow? But I think we as a country, we are going out from the momentum where we were kind of, growing country, poor country, with always these comments that there is a Eastern Europe and Western Europe.
As the era of the peace dividend and open global markets fades, indications point to a possible shift in Poland's economic strategy, regardless of who ends up in the presidential palace. Reporting for TVP World, I'm Aisha Badge.
European Union member states will discuss further whether to impose Article 7 of the EU treaty, that is suspending certain rights from a member state, on Hungary. On 27th of May, the EU Commissioner for Justice Michael McGrath said in response to a question by TVP World. Our Europe correspondent Alex Kerrier joins us now from Brussels. Good evening, Alex. So what can other EU member states actually do against Budapest?
Well, good evening. There is a raging debate among member states, and frankly, it has been rumbling on for a while now because of growing frustration with Hungary and its behavior when it comes to blocking aid for Ukraine, blocking sanctions against Russia, really going against the grain of most, if not all, of the other member states. And in the last couple of days, cracking down on LGBT rights, something that flies in the face of European values, according to Justice Commissioner Michael McGrath. He was taking a question from TVP World's Angela Skujins about exactly what the Commission is doing to push back against Hungary. Let's have a listen to what he said.
We have used all of the tools at our disposal, and at this point in time the different instruments amount to quite a significant financial sum. You're talking about in the region of between grants and loans approximately 18 billion euro not available to Hungary today because of rule of law breaches. And there was over €1 billion permanently lost at the end of last year under the conditionality regulation.
And that's what the Commission has been doing to push back against Hungary. But of course, the removal of voting rights will be down to the member states. As you rightly said in your introduction, that discussion will be tabled on the 27th of May in the General Affairs Council, where the EU ambassadors will discuss the possibility of moving against Hungary because of that growing frustration by member states. That frustration was expressed on TVP World's On the Record with Adam Yasser. He was speaking to Kolinda Grabar-Kitarovic, the former president of Croatia. Let's have a listen to that clip.
we have to be practical, and we have to look into the potential situations in the future where the security and stability of any EU country might be dependent of the will of any other single country. So devising the proper mechanisms and responding to the situation is the proper way to go ahead. I don't know how Croatia will vote and how other countries will vote. It's for them to decide. I just want for the EU really to be working and not be a paper tiger.
Not wanting the EU to be a paper tiger, wanting to see those member states take action. But the prospect of voting rights being stripped from Hungary remains very slim, because to get through the process to remove those voting rights, to stop Hungary from blocking EU movement on things like foreign affairs, requires a member state unanimity, including from Slovakia, which has been a smaller but still present thorn in the EU side and is unlikely to allow this process to move forward. Nevertheless, that growing frustration, growing pressure on the EU to do more against Hungary, we will have to wait a little bit longer to see if that frustration and that pressure turns into action.
And that was Alex Kettier reporting from Brussels. Thank you very much, Alex. Now, on the record with Adam Jasa is coming up right after World News Tonight. Adam's guest will be the former president of Croatia, Kolinda Grabar-Kitarovic, in a discussion on the current tensions in the Balkans, among others. The U.S. Secretary of State, Marco Rubio, and Donald Trump's special envoy, Steve Witkoff, are traveling to Paris to discuss the progress of peace talks with the European allies. We are joined now by our Ukraine correspondent, Oz Katerji. Good evening, Oz. So what should we expect from the Paris meeting, given the fact that after Steve Witkoff's meeting with Vladimir Putin, the Russian foreign minister has repeated Moscow's demands, including the cessation of territories, change of regime and army limitations, among others?
It seems difficult to understand where exactly these negotiations are going from the outside. We have no insight into the inner workings of what the actual Trump policy is towards these negotiations. We've heard some rather concerning things from Steve Witkoff about what he calls the 5 territories, those being the regions of Ukraine, 5 regions illegally annexed by Russia. Now, Ukrainians are obviously not going to agree to cede control, recognition of those territories to Russia. That's a non-starter politically for the Ukrainians, although that seems to be something that Steve Witkoff is interested in. It also seems to be a non-starter for the Europeans. So these discussions in Europe are going to be quite important for trying to bring these sides to understand their positions. The US has, for large parts of this process so far, been discussing Ukraine without Ukraine and discussing Ukraine without Europe. So meeting with French President Emmanuel Macron, Secretary of State Rubio was meeting with his French Foreign Minister counterpart, Jean-Noël Barrot. So these are going to be important discussions, particularly for the Europeans to argue their case to the US negotiators about what they think are unacceptable concessions to Russia. Particularly important will be what things are they going to, types of pressure are they going to apply to Moscow? It's important to note that Ukraine agreed to Donald Trump's proposed unconditional ceasefire, and the Russians have rejected it. So that's going to be a point of contention in these negotiations moving forward.
One more question, Oz. So there will be talks on peace in Paris, and there are talks underway on the rare earth minerals deal between Ukraine and the US. So what's the progress?
So we understand from Bloomberg reporting that the US has softened its demands on Ukraine. Part of the reason why these negotiations have stalled is the demand from the United States that Ukraine pays back $300 billion US dollars in what the US considers what they've given, or the Trump administration rather considers they have given to Ukraine in military aid. They want that back, and they've not offered anything with regards to further military aid or security guarantees in response to that. Now, we understand from Bloomberg's reporting that that number has been moved from 300 billion down to 100 billion, which is much closer to the Ukrainian 90 billion that they were mooting in discussions. At this point, discussions are still ongoing. We are still not at the point where anything is about to be imminently signed. But from Ukraine's perspective, these negotiations are certainly moving in a better direction than they were a few weeks ago.
That was Oskar Teji reporting from Kiev. Thank you very much, Os. Next month, the world will commemorate the 80th anniversary of the end of World War II in Europe. The celebrations, however, are being used by the Kremlin to sow more discord within the EU and among its candidate states. Some of the leaders intend to travel to Russia to take part in Putin's parade rather than attend the celebrations planned in the Ukrainian city of Lviv. The European Commission has already announced it will not punish the member states' leaders who would choose the Moscow parade. This, however, does not apply to candidate states. Michael von Blomenstein reports.
EU High Representative for Foreign Affairs Kaja Kallas has warned leaders who want their countries to join the bloc in the future.
We made it very clear that we don't want any candidate country to participate in these events on the 9th of May in Moscow, so that was very clear.
The annual May 9th parade through Moscow's Red Square is a show of the Kremlin's military might. It is ostensibly held to celebrate the defeat of Nazi Germany in World War II. A slew of Western leaders attended the parade in the past, including US Presidents Bill Clinton in 1995 and George W. Bush in 2005.
When the US president came to the parade in 1995 and stood next to Yeltsin, it was seen as support for reforms and support for democracy. Everyone was showing that the whole world was with us. Now being present shows support for Putin and authoritarianism, not democracy.
Even foreign troops, including members of the Polish armed forces, took part in the ceremony in 2010. That was 2 years after Russia's war against Georgia. Especially over the last 2 decades, the aim of the parade has been advancing the narrative that it was the Soviet Union alone that defeated Hitler's armies, according to political scientist and Kremlin expert Spasimir Domaracki. The symbolic meaning of world leaders attending the event is significant to the Kremlin.
What we see today, after 20 years of experience, and in particular after 3 years of experience with the Russian full-scale invasion on Ukraine, it's quite clear that when you participate in such an event, you actually legitimize what the Russians do.
A number of world leaders have been invited by the Kremlin this year, with Moscow claiming over 20 have confirmed their attendance without giving further details. These include Robert Fico, Slovakia's Prime Minister, who voiced his intention to come back in November, and Aleksandar Vučić, the President of Serbia. It is especially with Serbia in mind that Kallas made her remarks about attending. Hungarian Prime Minister Viktor Orbán, a Kremlin ally within the EU, has not been invited, however, and neither is Turkish President Recep Tayyip Erdogan. Meanwhile, the feelings among Russian dissidents around the parade are mixed. Every family had people fighting and dying during World War II.
Putin exploited it for his own interests. This angers many people because instead of celebrating right now, we're experiencing very complicated feelings because on the one hand, yes, it's a big holiday, but on the other hand, we don't want to show that we support Putin.
As an alternative to Moscow's invite, Ukraine has invited European leaders to come to Kyiv instead, to show their solidarity with the war-torn country.
And now let's take a closer look at one of the less obvious effects of tensions between the US and Europe. According to the American Tourism Office, some 17% Europeans less will travel this year to the US, thus hitting the industry with an $18 billion loss. The international attendance of the Football World Cup, co-organized by the US next year, is also in question. John Tarr reports on the tourism industry's troubles.
Tourists take in New York's Times Square, one of the world's most famous destinations. But this year, significantly fewer Europeans are now planning to head stateside for a taste of the Big Apple, or anywhere else in the US.
The predicted figures are now seeing a 15% decrease in what was predicted. This is unprecedented. These are the kind of figures that you would normally see when there has been a natural disaster in a country, when there has been some kind of pandemic or a terrorist attack in a country. So to see this amount of decrease is really unprecedented for the United States.
Analysts are warning the US travel industry could face an $18 billion hit as a result of changes after Donald Trump's return to the White House. US National Travel and Tourism Office figures for March indicate a 17% drop in Western Europeans visiting the US compared to the previous year. The so-called Trump slump follows a barrage of anti-European rhetoric, revised government travel advice, media reports of European travellers being held in jails at US borders, and international upheaval over tariffs.
Trump government, they don't want to work with Europe. They are expressing very negative position, very negative opinion about Europe. So this is natural reaction.
There are concerns around attendance at next year's FIFA World Cup, being held in the US, Canada and Mexico.
Fans from all around the world want to visit there. And if you're from a country like Brazil or a country like Turkey or a country like Colombia and you're a football fan, and you're seeing that there's a 700-day delay for a visa, it doesn't make you feel confident in booking those tickets to visit the games.
And there are also concerns over the 2028 Summer Olympics.
And the Olympic Committee has already raised concerns regarding, are there going to be visa issues for athletes? Are there going to be visa issues for fans?
Experts warn that travel is easily impacted by sentiment, and it's often the first expense cut when people feel the financial pinch. The industry is hoping that the scale of potential losses in the US 18 million-strong travel industry may make the Trump administration rethink the way it currently welcomes visitors. John Todd for TVP World.
When Russia began the full-scale invasion of Ukraine in 2022, the European Union decided it will wean itself off Russian gas by 2027. But now we hear members of the European business community, including CEOs of major energy companies, saying they would still like to supply the commodity from Moscow. Let's hear the full story in Jan Kennedy's report.
For decades, Russia has been the leading provider of fossil fuels to the European Union, but in less than 2 years, that could become a thing of the past. European Commission President Ursula von der Leyen told the Financial Times that a roadmap to completely wean Europe off Russian energy imports starting 2027 will see daylight in a few weeks, but for the time being, major hurdles persist.
The rumors are floating in Brussels that the main, for now, the main issue is the standing long-term contracts and how make companies, European companies, not to pay to Russia if these contracts would be basically cut.
Such a ban would require a unanimous decision from all 27 member states, which landlocked Slovakia and Hungary would likely oppose. Another option, according to Brussels-based think tank Bruegel, would be to impose tariffs which don't require unanimity. But it also seems that some members of the European business community have become more open to discussing a resumption of the Russian supply.
Europe will never go back to importing 150 billion cubic meters from Russia like before the war, but I would bet maybe 70 BCM.
And it's not only big energy firms, and not only in France. Another example is the operator of Leuna, one of Germany's biggest chemical plants.
That would be an important incentive for Russia in the peace negotiations. For Ukraine, it would mean income from transit fees. For European industry, natural gas prices would fall and competitiveness would increase.
Why is the talk about Russian gas back? Executives say that they are desperate for a cheaper source of supply as the energy crisis chips away at their profits.
Last year we made a loss for the first time since the privatization 30 years ago. Not a small one. We can't afford that in the long term. Our electricity costs were just over 1 million a month before the crisis. Now we are at 2.3 million.
For decades, the company relied on cheap imports of Russian pipeline gas, which were cut off after Russia's full-scale invasion of Ukraine. In 2024, Russia supplied around 18% of the EU's demand for natural gas, 11% of which was sent via pipelines, the rest in liquefied form. US LNG deliveries covered 16% of the demand and have been a crucial replacement for the Russian commodity. However, since Donald Trump's return to office, relations between Washington and Brussels have soured, raising concerns about the reliability of US supply. But experts see these woos as far-fetched.
The US, I wouldn't call them, for now, unreliable partners, because, well, companies trade, and the system in the United States, of course, is totally different than in comparison to Russia.
Katinas added that while discounted Russian pipeline deliveries may seem tempting, tightening cooperation with the Kremlin will eventually come back to bite the EU.
You can solve some issues in the short-term period when it comes to Russian gas. However, in the long period, the price might increase, because Russia already proved numerous times for the past 35 years that around 50 or 60 times they were not credible partners.
For the time being, Russian gas continues flowing to Europe. The coming weeks will tell whether it will stop.
The lessons from Romania's presidential elections have shown that Europe's democracies are vulnerable to Russia's hybrid operations. As the presidential vote in Poland approaches quickly, the Kremlin intensifies its actions against the country. What awaits us in the coming weeks, and what is Moscow trying to achieve? And to talk about it all, we are joined by Anna Gielewska, editor-in-chief of V-Square, who also investigates organized disinformation. Good evening.
Good evening. Hello.
So, what is the nature of cyber attacks in Poland, and could you give us some examples?
Well, sure. Indeed, the number is increasing, and what we've been observing and monitoring last weeks is simultaneously an increase in cyber attacks, as stated by the Minister Gawkowski today, but of course also sabotage attacks that are increasing last month significantly, and disinformation attacks, because those are different kind of weapons within the broader hybrid information war. And I would say, the landscape is becoming more and more complex. So you ask for examples. Just from last week's, we heard about the cyber attack on Civic Platform Bureau, and accounts still, I understand, investigated, because we so far don't have any public statements related to that incident. So we don't know whether some sensitive data were obtained and might be used, as in the Michał Dworczyk case. So the so-called email scandal from the past few years, that is actually still ongoing. So we had that attack. We of course had this growing. Those cyber attacks on critical infrastructure are kind of ongoing situations. So, and as a country, I believe we are reacting quite effectively. It's definitely much less effective when it comes to information operations.
You remember that was actually the beginning of this month, when some 60,000 people around Warsaw were deprived of water because it was contaminated. Now, could this be also a Russian hybrid attack? Because Minister Gawkowski today, he mentioned attacks against the water infrastructure.
I believe we can't exclude such a scenario, and with all this recent sabotage attacks that at first looked somewhat, undefined, suspicious, and so on, but without attribution or conclusion. After a few months, it turned out that they were part of the broader, Russian hybrid actions. So it might be. We can't exclude, as with the, fires for the Polish market, and this Wrocław case that was investigated. So there are sabotage attacks, there are cyber attacks, there are growing info ops, information, disinformation attacks. We see a growing number of social media content that is either aligned with Kremlin interests or aimed at polarizing us even more than we are.
And here's something I want to ask you about specifically. Now, who is to profit from this sort of misinformation in Poland? Could you point to some presidential candidates? Because we were talking about the threats during the upcoming elections?
So we already have like openly Kremlin, pro-Kremlin candidate that somewhat surprisingly collected the mandate number of signatures, which is 133. I mean, he collected 130,000, and out of sudden showed up during the presidential debate, reaching with directly very open Kremlin propaganda, millions of audiences of the TVP.
Right,
so
the very same scenario happened in Romania not that long ago, when a basically unknown candidate has won the first round of the presidential election. Now, do you believe that such a scenario can repeat itself in Poland next month?
I doubt it will be repeated when it comes to method and tactics, because the person we are talking about grew primarily on TikTok. And of course, TikTok is like one of the developing, emerging platform and threat within the Polish information landscape. But I don't think that, out of sudden we will see some TikTok candidate. Maciej Maciek, because that's the person I'm referring to, has been long present within the broader Kremlin propaganda infrastructure. He used to run a local TV spreading openly, Kremlin propaganda, inviting Kremlin propagandists to that for years already. He tried to enter the Polish political scene, being a candidate for local elections and now a presidential election. So I wouldn't say like he's, like a person out of nowhere. Although out of nowhere he collected the signatures, which allowed him to enter the system.
We'll have to wait and see what it translates into in the first round of the presidential
but we have other candidates
elections.
Too.
Yes, there are
we
many,
and we could
I would say we could talk about them for a long time, but actually we're running out of time, which is a shame. Anna Gierewska, editor-in-chief of Wisła, thank you very much. And thank you for watching. That would be all for now, but don't go away, as Adam says, On the Record is coming up next.